In the cold marble halls of First National Bank on a Tuesday morning, that would forever change how we understand loyalty, an 80-year-old man named Colonel Davis stood trembling in line, his weathered hands gripping a crumpled deposit slip, while his faithful companion Kilo, a golden Labrador with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of 1,000 battles, pressed close against his legs, sensing the rising storm within his master's mind. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across the faces of impatient customers who tapped their phones and checked their watches, completely unaware that they were about to witness an act of intelligence so profound it would leave armed police officers speechless and questioning everything they thought they knew about the bond between man and animal. Colonel Davis had served his country with distinction for 37 years, his chest adorned with medals that spoke of courage under fire, leadership in the darkest moments, and sacrifices that most people could never comprehend. But now, in his twilight years, he faced an enemy more insidious than any he had encountered on foreign battlefields. The neurological condition that plagued him was a cruel twist of fate, a rare form of cataplexy that could strike without warning when his senses became overwhelmed, leaving him paralyzed and helpless, while his mind remained perfectly aware of everything happening around him. The doctors had explained it in clinical terms that felt as cold as the marble beneath his feet, but what they couldn't capture in their medical jargon was the terror of being trapped inside his own body, conscious but unable to move, speak, or signal for help, while the world continued to spin around him in indifferent chaos. Kilo had been more than a companion these past 3 years since his diagnosis, more than a pet, more than even a service animal in the traditional sense. He was a guardian angel wrapped in golden fur, trained not just to guide the blind or alert to seizures, but to recognize the subtle signs that preceded his master's episodes, the slight tremor in his hands, the change in his breathing pattern, the way his pupils would dilate just moments before his nervous system would betray him completely. The bond between them transcended the usual relationship between human and dog, forged in the crucible of vulnerability, and strengthened by countless moments when Kilo's presence had been the difference between dignity and disaster, between safety and catastrophe. But this morning felt different from the moment they had entered the bank's imposing lobby with its towering ceilings and echoing footsteps that seemed to amplify every sound into a cacophony of urban anxiety. The line stretched endlessly before them, a serpentine queue of humanity that moved with the sluggish pace of bureaucracy, while overhead speakers crackled with announcements about new services and security protocols that nobody seemed to be listening to, but which added another layer to the sensory assault that was slowly overwhelming the colonel's already fragile nervous system. The conversations around them blended into a white noise of complaints about wait times, discussions of financial troubles, and the occasional sharp laugh that cut through the air like a blade, each sound adding weight to the invisible burden that was pressing down on his shoulders with increasing intensity. If you've ever found yourself moved by stories of loyalty and courage that transcend the ordinary boundaries of what we think is possible, then you're going to want to subscribe to Lab of Love right now, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you believe about intelligence, devotion, and the extraordinary lengths that love will go to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And I promise you that by the end of this story, you'll never look at the bond between humans and animals the same way again. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness as the colonel felt his grip on composure beginning to slip like sand through his fingers, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid while Kilo pressed closer against his legs, the dog's warm body providing an anchor of comfort in the growing storm of sensory overload that was building inside his master's mind like a pressure cooker about to explode. The bank teller's voice seemed to grow louder and more intrusive with each customer served. The clicking of high heels on marble echoed like gunshots in his ears, and the fluorescent lights above began to flicker in a rhythm that seemed to match his racing heartbeat, creating a perfect storm of triggers that his damaged nervous system could no longer filter or process without breaking down completely. Kilo's training had taught him to recognize these signs long before they became visible to human observers, and as he felt the tension radiating from his master's body like heat from a fever, he began to implement the protocols he had been taught, pressing his nose against the colonel's hand in a gentle reminder to focus on breathing, positioning his body to provide physical support should his master's legs begin to weaken, and maintaining the constant vigilance that had become second nature to him over their years together. But the environment was too chaotic, the stimuli too overwhelming, and despite his best efforts to provide comfort and grounding, he could sense that his master was fighting a losing battle against the neurological storm that was gathering strength with each passing moment. The breaking point came without warning, as it always did, when a child somewhere behind them in line began to cry with the piercing wail that only a frightened toddler can produce, the sound cutting through the ambient noise like a siren and triggering something deep within the colonel's already overloaded nervous system. His body went rigid for a split second before his knees buckled and he collapsed to the cold marble floor, his eyes wide open and aware, but his muscles completely unresponsive to the desperate commands his brain was sending, leaving him trapped in the nightmare scenario he had feared most, helpless and vulnerable in a public space filled with strangers who had no idea what was happening to him or how to help. The people around him barely paused in their conversations, some glancing down with mild curiosity before looking away, others stepping around his prone form as if he were nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle in their path to the teller windows, their indifference a crushing weight that added psychological torment to his physical paralysis. A few individuals did stop to stare, their faces showing confusion and discomfort rather than concern, but none of them approached or offered assistance, perhaps assuming he was drunk or homeless, or simply choosing not to get involved in what they perceived as someone else's problem, leaving him alone on the floor with only Kilo standing guard beside him, like a sentinel in a hostile world. Kilo immediately began his standard emergency protocol, placing his paws on his master's chest and applying gentle pressure to signal to any observers that this was a medical emergency, not a case of intoxication or drug use. But the people around them seemed to interpret his actions as a dog simply playing or seeking attention, their urban conditioning having taught them to ignore rather than engage with situations that made them uncomfortable. He tried barking, a sharp alert that should have drawn immediate attention to his master's plight, but the sound was lost in the acoustic chaos of the bank lobby, absorbed by the high ceilings and drowned out by the constant hum of conversation and electronic noise that filled the space like fog. The dog's frustration was palpable, as he realized that his conventional training was failing him in this moment, when his master needed help most desperately. The usual protocols that had served them well in quieter, more controlled environments, proving useless against the indifference of a crowded public space where people had learned to tune out anything that didn't directly concern them. He could see his master's eyes, still alert and aware but filled with a terror that went beyond physical discomfort to touch something deeper, the fear of being abandoned and helpless that haunted every person who had ever found themselves at the mercy of strangers in their most vulnerable moment. Time seemed to stretch like taffy as Kilo sat beside his paralyzed master, his intelligent brown eyes scanning the lobby for any sign of authority or compassion that might translate into the help they so desperately needed. But the bank security guard was focused on his monitors. The tellers were absorbed in their transactions, and the customers continued their self-absorbed shuffle through the line as if nothing unusual was happening just a few feet away from them. The dog's training had prepared him for many scenarios, but not for this level of human indifference, not for the crushing realization that in a world full of people, his master could still be completely alone when crisis struck. It was then, in that moment of desperation when conventional solutions had failed and time was running out, that Kilo's remarkable intelligence revealed itself in a way that would leave everyone who witnessed it questioning the boundaries between instinct and reasoning, between training and innovation, between animal behavior and something approaching human-level problem-solving that transcended everything they thought they knew about canine capabilities. His eyes had been scanning the environment not just for people who might help, but for systems, for mechanisms, for any tool that might be used to summon the assistance his master needed. And in that desperate search, his gaze fell upon something that would never have occurred to a human in crisis, but which represented to his loyal and creative mind the perfect solution to an impossible problem. Near the base of the teller counter, almost hidden behind a decorative panel but visible to anyone at floor level, was a small red button that most customers never noticed, and probably wouldn't have recognized even if they had seen it clearly. But Kilo's training had made him acutely aware of his environment in ways that extended far beyond the usual scope of service animal education. This was the silent alarm system, the bank's last line of defense against robbery, designed to summon armed police response without alerting potential criminals to the fact that help was on the way. a system so sensitive and powerful that its activation would bring the full force of law enforcement crashing down on this marble-floored lobby within minutes. The moral complexity of what Kilo was contemplating would have given pause to any human. The ethics of triggering a false alarm that would waste police resources, potentially endanger innocent people, and certainly cause chaos and confusion throughout the bank. But for a dog whose world had narrowed to a single imperative, the need to save his master from a medical emergency that no one else seemed to recognize or care about, the choice was as clear as the love that had motivated it. He looked once more at his master's face, saw the fear and helplessness in those eyes that had seen so much in 8 decades of life, and made a decision that would later be called everything from genius to madness, from heroic to criminal, but which was, in its essence, simply love translated into action. If you're feeling your heart racing right now, if you're on the edge of your seat wondering what happens next, then you need to hit that like button right now and let me know in the comments below whether you think what Kilo was about to do was justified, because what happened in the next 60 seconds would change everyone's definition of loyalty forever, and I want to hear from you about whether you think a dog can truly understand the concept of sacrifice, whether animals can make moral choices, and whether love can justify breaking the rules when the stakes are life and death. With a deliberation that spoke to intelligence rather than instinct, Kilo approached the alarm button with the careful precision of a soldier approaching a sensitive mission. His movements controlled and purposeful as he positioned himself at the optimal angle to access the device that represented his master's only hope for rescue. The button was designed to be activated by human hands in moments of extreme crisis, but Kilo's paw, guided by desperation and love, would serve the same function with perhaps even greater moral authority than any bank employee who might have used it to summon help for themselves. He raised his front paw, looked one last time at his paralyzed master lying helpless on the cold marble floor, and with a firm, decisive motion that would later be replayed on security cameras and analyzed by experts who would struggle to explain what they were seeing, he pressed the silent alarm that would bring the full force of the law crashing down on this temple of commerce. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A cascade of events that began with invisible signals racing through fiber optic cables to police dispatch centers and escalated within moments to the coordinated deployment of armed response teams who had been trained to treat bank alarms as matters of life and death, potential hostage situations that required immediate and decisive intervention. The irony was not lost on those who would later analyze the situation, that in order to save one life, Kilo had activated a system designed to protect many lives, that his false alarm for a real emergency had demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that most humans would have been proud to claim as their own. The lobby continued its normal rhythm for perhaps 90 seconds after the alarm was triggered. The customers and staff blissfully unaware that they were now at the center of a police operation that was unfolding with military precision in the streets outside, that marked vehicles were converging on their location from multiple directions, that tactical teams were reviewing building layouts and planning entry strategies based on the assumption that armed criminals were holding the bank under siege. The colonel remained paralyzed on the floor, his condition unchanged, but his time running out as the medical emergency that had triggered this entire chain of events continued to ravage his nervous system without intervention, while Kilo sat calmly beside him, his mission accomplished, his faith in human authority about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. The first sign that something had changed came when the bank's own security systems began to activate in response to protocols triggered by the silent alarm, automatic door locks engaging, internal cameras switching to emergency recording mode, and staff members receiving coded messages through their earpieces that would normally have sent them into hiding, but which, in this case, only added to the confusion as they looked around the lobby and saw no obvious threat, no armed individuals, no signs of the robbery that their systems were reporting to police headquarters across the city. The security guard stood up from his station, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio as he tried to reconcile the alarm signals with the apparently peaceful scene before him, his eyes scanning the crowd for suspicious behavior while completely missing the paralyzed veteran lying on the floor and the loyal dog whose intelligence had just outsmarted the entire banking security system. The sound of screeching tires outside began to penetrate the thick glass windows of the bank, followed by the slam of car doors and the rapid footsteps of multiple individuals moving with military precision toward the building's entrance. sounds that would normally have caused alarm among the customers but which were initially dismissed as routine city noise by people who had learned to tune out the urban symphony that surrounded them daily. But Kilo's ears, far more sensitive than any human's, picked up these sounds and identified them for exactly what they were: the approaching cavalry that he had summoned through his desperate gambit, the armed response that would soon burst through the doors with the power to command attention and respect in a way that his conventional alerts had failed to achieve. The moment of truth arrived with the explosive sound of the bank's main entrance being thrown open by officers who had expected to find themselves facing armed criminals, but instead encountered a scene that defied every training scenario they had ever practiced: a lobby full of confused civilians who looked more annoyed than terrified, tellers who were clearly not under duress, and absolutely no sign of the robbery that had triggered their emergency response. The lead officer, Sergeant Martinez, a 20-year veteran of the force who had responded to more bank alarms than he cared to count, swept the room with his weapon drawn and his eyes searching for threats that simply weren't there, his tactical mind trying to process a situation that made no sense according to any protocol he had ever learned. It was in that moment of confusion, as armed police officers found themselves in a standoff with nothing, that Kilo made his presence known in the most dramatic way possible by rising from his position beside his master and walking calmly toward the lead officer, his tail wagging slightly in a gesture that seemed to say that yes, he was the one who had called them. Yes, he knew exactly what he had done. And yes, he was prepared to show them why he had done it. The sight of this golden Labrador approaching him with such calm confidence in the middle of what should have been a high-stakes criminal situation caused Sergeant Martinez to lower his weapon slightly, his cop instincts telling him that something was very wrong with this picture, that the dog's behavior was too purposeful, too intelligent, too much like a person trying to communicate rather than an animal reacting to stress. Kilo led the officers directly to his master's prone form, sitting down beside the colonel and placing one paw gently on his chest, in a gesture so clearly communicative that even the most skeptical observer would have had to acknowledge that this was deliberate behavior, not random animal movement, a dog trying to show rather than simply react, to teach rather than simply respond to his environment. Sergeant Martinez knelt down beside the paralyzed veteran, his trained eyes immediately recognizing the signs of a medical emergency that everyone else in the bank had either missed or ignored. The dilated pupils, the rapid but shallow breathing, the complete muscle rigidity that spoke of neurological crisis rather than loss of consciousness. And in that moment of professional recognition, he understood that he was looking at the most remarkable case of animal intelligence he had ever encountered. The veteran's military bearing was evident even in his paralyzed state, his posture and bearing speaking of decades of service and discipline, while his eyes, wide with awareness but unable to communicate, held a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment that touched something deep in the sergeant's heart, as he realized that this man, who had probably faced enemy fire without flinching, had been reduced to helplessness in a place where he should have been safe, surrounded by people who should have helped him, but had instead walked away from his crisis as if he were invisible. The metal ribbons on his jacket told a story of courage and sacrifice that made his current vulnerability all the more heartbreaking, a reminder that heroism and helplessness could coexist in the same person, that the strong could become weak and the protectors could need protection in ways that society was often too busy or too callous to recognize. The realization of what had actually happened began to dawn on the assembled officers like sunrise after a long night. The understanding that this dog had not accidentally triggered the alarm, had not acted from confusion or fear, but had made a conscious decision to use the bank's own security system against itself, in order to summon help for his paralyzed master when all other options had failed, a level of strategic thinking that challenged every assumption they had about animal intelligence and forced them to confront the possibility that they were witnesses to something unprecedented in the annals of interspecies communication and problem-solving. Officer Johnson, a canine handler with 15 years of experience working with police dogs, stared at Kilo with a mixture of admiration and disbelief, his professional understanding of canine behavior telling him that what he was witnessing was theoretically impossible, while his eyes were showing him evidence that theory and reality didn't always align in the neat categories that training manuals preferred to maintain. He had worked with dogs who could find drugs, detect explosives, track suspects, and perform dozens of other specialized tasks. But he had never seen a dog demonstrate this level of abstract reasoning, this ability to manipulate human systems and institutions to achieve a goal that had nothing to do with their specific training, and everything to do with pure intelligence applied to an unprecedented situation. The bank's security footage would later confirm what everyone suspected but nobody wanted to believe: that Kilo had approached the alarm button with clear purpose, had positioned himself carefully, and had pressed it with deliberate force, his actions showing none of the randomness or confusion that might have explained away his behavior as accidental, but instead revealing a mind that had assessed the situation, identified the problem, evaluated the available solutions, and chosen the most effective course of action despite the moral and legal complexities that such a choice entailed. The video would be analyzed by animal behaviorists, law enforcement experts, and ethicists who would debate its implications for years to come. But for the officers standing in that marble lobby, the immediate reality was simpler and more profound than any academic discussion could capture. Paramedics arrived within minutes of the police, their medical training allowing them to quickly assess and stabilize the colonel's condition with the kind of professional efficiency that his paralyzed state had made impossible for the bank customers to provide, their presence transforming a scene of abandonment and indifference into one of competent care and human compassion that restored some faith in the species that had failed him so completely in his moment of greatest need. The neurological episode that had trapped him in his own body began to subside, as stress hormones were replaced by the relief of knowing that help had finally arrived, that his loyal companion's desperate gambit had succeeded in ways that conventional calls for assistance never could have achieved in that environment of urban apathy and institutional indifference. As the colonel's mobility slowly returned and he was able to communicate with his rescuers, the full story of his condition and Kilo's training began to emerge, painting a picture of a bond between man and animal that transcended the usual boundaries of pet ownership or even service animal relationships to enter territory that philosophers and theologians had long claimed was reserved for human beings alone, the realm of moral reasoning and sacrificial love that was supposed to separate us from the rest of the animal kingdom, but which seemed to be present in abundant measure in this golden Labrador who had risked everything to save his master. The bank employees who had ignored the colonel's collapse, the customers who had stepped around his body, the security guard who had failed to recognize a medical emergency happening directly under his supervision, all found themselves confronted with the uncomfortable reality that they had been shown up by a dog, that their human intelligence and supposed moral superiority had been revealed as inadequate when compared to the loyalty and quick thinking of an animal who had refused to accept their indifference as the final word on his master's fate. The shame in their faces was evident as they realized that they had failed to live up to standards that a dog had not only met but exceeded, that they had been found wanting when measured against the simple principle that those who cannot help themselves deserve the assistance of those who can. Sergeant Martinez found himself in the unusual position of having to explain to his superiors that the bank alarm that had triggered a major police response had been activated not by criminals or even by bank employees, but by a service dog who had made what could only be described as a command decision to manipulate human institutions in service of a greater good, a report that would require him to use language and concepts that had never appeared in any police manual but which seemed to be the only adequate way to describe what he had witnessed in that marble lobby where intelligence and loyalty had intersected in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, reasoning, and moral agency. The story of Kilo's heroic deception would spread far beyond the walls of that bank, rippling outward through social media, news reports, and word of mouth to touch the hearts of people around the world who found themselves questioning their own assumptions about animal intelligence, human compassion, and the nature of heroism in an age when such qualities seemed to be in increasingly short supply. Pet owners would look at their own companions with new eyes, wondering what depths of understanding and loyalty might be hidden behind those trusting gazes, while others would be forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that they had been living in a world where a dog's moral reasoning had proven superior to their own indifference and self-absorption. The legal implications of Kilo's actions would be debated by scholars and lawyers who struggled to apply human concepts of intent and responsibility to an animal who had clearly acted with purpose and forethought, but who could not be held accountable under legal systems designed exclusively for human actors, creating a fascinating intersection of law, ethics, and biology that would provide material for academic papers and courtroom arguments for years to come. The question of whether triggering a false alarm could be considered justified when the purpose was to save a life would be complicated by the fact that the one who had made that decision was not technically a legal person, creating precedents and paradoxes that would challenge the very foundations of how society understood responsibility, agency, and moral authority. But beyond the academic debates and legal complexities, the story of what happened in that bank lobby would endure as something simpler and more profound, a testament to the power of love to transcend the boundaries that society had erected between species, between the rational and the instinctual, between the acceptable and the extraordinary, proving that heroism could take forms that no human authority had ever imagined, and that the greatest acts of courage sometimes came from the most unexpected sources, wrapped in golden fur and motivated by nothing more complex or sophisticated than pure, unconditional devotion to another living being. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think differently about the animals in your life or the strangers you encounter in your daily routine, then I need you to do 3 things right now. First, smash that like button to let me know that stories like this matter to you and should be told more often. Second, share this video with everyone you know because the world needs more examples of loyalty and intelligence triumphing over indifference and ignorance. And third, subscribe to Lab of Love and hit that notification bell because we're dedicated to bringing you stories that restore your faith in the power of love, to overcome any obstacle. And I want to hear from you in the comments about whether you think humans have something to learn from Kilo's example, whether you've ever witnessed animal intelligence that defied explanation, and what you think this story says about the nature of heroism in our modern world. The Colonel would recover fully from his episode, but the memory of lying helpless on that marble floor while strangers stepped around him would stay with him for the rest of his life, a reminder of how quickly human dignity could be stripped away, and how precious was the loyalty of the one creature who had refused to abandon him in his darkest moment. Kilo would return to his normal duties as a service dog, but his fame would follow him wherever he went, his photograph appearing in newspapers and magazines around the world as the dog who had outsmarted a bank's security system in order to save his master's life, his story becoming a legend that would be retold in veterinary schools, police academies, and animal behavior courses as an example of intelligence and loyalty that defied every category that science had created to explain the difference between human and animal consciousness. The bank would eventually install new protocols for recognizing medical emergencies, their staff receiving training on how to identify signs of distress that might otherwise be overlooked in the busy routine of daily business. A change that would benefit countless future customers but which would also serve as a permanent reminder of the day when their indifference had been exposed by the moral clarity of a dog who had understood, better than any human present, what it meant to leave no one behind, to refuse to accept abandonment as acceptable, and to use whatever tools were available to ensure that help arrived for those who needed it most. In the end, the story of Kilo's fake robbery alarm would become more than just an account of one remarkable dog's intelligence and loyalty. It would serve as a mirror held up to human society, reflecting back our own capacity for both callous indifference and profound compassion, our tendency to create systems and institutions that can be both obstacles to justice and tools for its achievement, and our need to remain open to the possibility that wisdom and heroism can come from the most unexpected sources, teaching us lessons that we desperately need to learn about what it means to truly care for one another in a world that too often rewards selfishness and punishes vulnerability. The Colonel would live for many more years, his condition managed and his independence maintained, but he would never forget the day when his faithful companion had proven that love could indeed move mountains, or at least trigger bank alarms, and that the bond between them was stronger than any challenge that life might throw their way. A partnership that had been tested in the crucible of crisis and had emerged more powerful than ever, a testament to the transformative power of loyalty, intelligence, and unconditional love that transcends every boundary that the world tries to erect between different forms of consciousness and different definitions of what it means to be truly, heroically, magnificently alive.